The construction of the World Trade Center marked a new era of American optimism in the 1960s.
It was the project of the century. Everybody wanted to work on the World Trade Center.
The latest in building technology allowed designers to go higher and bigger than anything the world had ever seen.
It was just whammo, you know, the two biggest skyscrapers in the world.
But then came the 11th of September, 2001. It's still not known how many people perished in this nightmare of collapsing steel and dust. Now, as the site is being cleared, serious questions are emerging about the buildings themselves. Was the collapse inevitable? And why were so many people trapped inside, unable to escape? New evidence suggests that the World Trade Center may have been uniquely vulnerable to the attack, and that its design prevented people from escaping before one of the world's premier buildings was reduced to this. Less than 3 miles from where the towers once stood, the clues to their collapse lie in gigantic twisted heaps. Pile upon pile of high-strength steel in this New Jersey scrapyard. Time is short. The evidence is being cut into chunks for export to recycling plants in the Far East. The deals with the scrap merchants have already been done. As each massive piece arrives, huge grappling machines struggle to cope with lumps of metal that weigh over twice as much as the trucks used to transport them. The very ground shakes as they drop just a few feet. That some of this steel fell a quarter of a mile to earth is difficult to believe. And how anyone inside survived is hard to imagine. But a few did survive, among them some firemen who witnessed the destruction firsthand as they helped an elderly woman down the stairs in the North Tower.
We were all in this little pocket in this stairway between the 4th and the 2nd floor. And this unbelievable sound, I still remember the sound of steel, these massive steel beams that are roughly 5 feet deep, twisting around us like they were little twist ties off a loaf of bread. I'll never forget it.
In one sense, the reason that the Twin Towers fell is obvious. They were, after all, hit by large aircraft whose tanks were full of jet fuel. But it's by no means certain that any other skyscraper would have collapsed so soon or so completely. The person who perhaps knows most about the World Trade Center is the structural engineer who built it, whose offices are in this building in Lower Manhattan. They used to have a commanding view of the complex, but now they overlook the biggest salvage operation New York has ever seen.
The responsibility for arriving, if you will, at the at the ultimate strength of the tower was mine. And the fact that they didn't stand longer could be laid at my feet. Do I feel guilty about it, about the fact that they collapsed? The circumstances on the 11th of September were outside of that which we considered in the design. Today, if I knew then what I know now, they would have stood longer, of course.
Back in the 60s, when terrorist strikes were not a credible threat, the towers won many awards for their engineering, which was cutting edge for its day. The way in which they were built, and to some extent the way in which they collapsed, was due to the extraordinary demands made by the scale of the project. It was to have more office space than the entire city of Liverpool. Taller than anything ever built, in a town where high winds can be a severe problem. All this to solve a common blight: inner city decay.
In the mid-60s, American cities were very troubled. There was poverty, there was crime, there were race riots, there was a lot of worry about whether or not they could even survive. New York was troubled. There was a lot of worry about New York's future.
It was decided that a rundown area known as Radio Row should be demolished and replaced with a high-technology landmark building, something rather more fitting for a country that was about to embark on the space race.
It was a classic American response to a problem, which is hit it right down the middle with as much firepower as you can give it. 210-story boxes, the tallest towers in the world. Well, that was going to fix everything, right? That's how we thought in the 1960s.
Back then, the man in charge was Guy Tozzoli, who 35 years later saw the towers fall as he drove to work.
Honestly, I never thought the towers would collapse. It just never occurred to me. They had stood there since 1970 when we opened, and it just didn't seem possible. I remember I cried, sitting in the car.
In happier times, Mr. T, as he was known to his staff, was put in charge of what the Reader's Digest called the biggest building project since the pyramids.
My job was to make a program which the architects would follow. How many feet of office space, how many feet of consumer service area, a place for customs, a hotel, and then to find the architectural team that could carry it out.
The architect was to be Minoru Yamasaki, or Yama as he was known, a Japanese-American who died in 1986. He conceived of a pair of 80-story towers sprouting from a huge open plaza. But even these giants would not have enough office space for Mr. T.
I said, well, does it meet our program? No, he said, it's not. It's 2 million square feet short. Well, I said, why is that? Well, he said, you can't build a building taller than 80 floors. And I said, why? Well, he said, because the elevatoring in buildings taller than 80 floors make it impossible to be rentable.
The problem was that with a building over 80 stories tall, so much of the lower floors are taken up with the elevators needed to service the upper floors that the building becomes uneconomic. But this little problem wasn't going to stop Guy Tozzoli.
And I remember saying to Yama, President Kennedy is going to put a man on the moon. I think you could build us the tallest buildings in the world.
The way the problem was solved was to treat each third of the skyscraper as a separate 40-story building, so that fewer elevator shafts would be needed. This pattern was repeated 3 times, and the whole system was linked together with 2 express elevators that were the only ones that would go the whole height of the building.
If you went to an upper floor of the World Trade Center, you didn't get in the elevator at the ground floor and go to your floor. You got into a big, giant elevator that was an express to what was called a sky lobby. And there you switched for a local elevator to your individual floor. That's what they did, and that's how the buildings happened.
Solving the elevator problem meant that it was now possible to build on an unprecedented scale, to construct towers that would eventually become synonymous with America itself.
We were constructing a building which put up high in the air a huge amount of rentable space, much more so than any building in the past, or indeed any building today. In order to do that, we had to rethink the whole process of designing and the technology that went into the design.
It quickly became clear that New York's occasional 100-mile-an-hour winds would be the dominant factor.
The lateral push of the wind on the World Trade Center is perhaps 4 or 5 times larger than the earthquake load would be if you build it in Los Angeles or in Tokyo.
Such a vast building would be blown about in the wind, and it would not only lean backwards, a dangerous side-to-side oscillation could occur. For the first time, a wind tunnel was used to analyze the movement of the buildings in hurricane-force winds, and it showed that if they were not correctly designed, the towers would shake themselves to pieces.
We had to think about the dynamics of the motion of the building, not just the fact that it leaned a little bit in the wind.
The solution was to make the building of high-strength steel concentrated in the exterior walls, a unique and dramatic departure from conventional skyscraper design.
Most skyscrapers are built on steel or concrete frames, which is a grid of columns and beams that goes all the way through the building. The World Trade Center was different. It was what engineers call a tube structure. It was a very, very strong mesh of steel that surrounded the exterior.
The way in which these walls were built was equally ingenious. 3 30-foot-long columns were welded together off-site to make a relatively lightweight yet rigid prefabricated panel. This was then hoisted up to join thousands of similar pieces, forming a massively strong wall of steel. In the middle stood a steel core, which would contain all the stairwells and the elevators, giving the towers one of their major selling points: large, open floor spaces.
Tenants like open space. It's flexible. It allows them to have big open rooms if they want, or to put temporary partitions anywhere they please.
There was another advantage to this system. It would save money.
You could do a tube structure with roughly half the amount of steel than you would need for a conventional frame that goes all the way through the structure, but it would hold up just as well. It would be just as strong.
The end result was a building of extraordinary structural efficiency. Hundreds of acres of office space held high in the sky by the clever use of steel. Steel that now lies in a scrapyard, and which contains the secret of how this revolutionary design was undone.